Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Lesson 3b in World History. This lesson we're going to be talking about absolutism, and that's a concept that also is going to be focused predominantly on Europe. And as we've seen, kind of the transition from Europe from the Dark Ages into the Renaissance, and now we're moving on into, with the exception of England, kind of the era of the very, very powerful king or monarch, and that's what we're going to be talking about this time in Lesson 3b. So a little bit of a preview of what we're going to talk about. We're going to first look at France under the classic absolutist monarch, Louis XIV, also known as the Sun King because of the power and grandiose nature of his rule. Then we're going to look at absolutism in Eastern Europe, specifically Russia and Peter the Great. And then we're going to talk a little specifically about the Baroque period. Baroque is a time frame when there was a great deal of ostentation, which is a fancy word to say people showing off their wealth. So that's really the focus of this particular week. The reading that you guys are going to do out of your textbook is going to be the second half of chapter 14, specifically pages 441 to 451. So 10 pages there, and you know the drill. You do this, watch this, and then you do the reading, and that should get you right where you need to be for your lesson. Key terms. Here's the ones you need to know. A couple of them we just talked about. Absolutism, ostentation, czar, C-Z-A-R is spelled czar, or is pronounced czar, Baroque, and natural rights. And we'll be focusing on those both in this video and also in the text. So what is this idea of absolutism? Well, essentially, monarchs all over Europe were worried about the loss of power. And we really saw that last time in Lesson 3a when we were looking at England especially. We saw the deterioration of power leaving the monarchs, going to the nobles. And that was something that other monarchs, especially in France and Germany and elsewhere, wanted to try to avoid. So the kings developed an idea of absolutism in which the ruler, the king, holds ultimate power. So all the power is delivered upon the king's head. The nobles have very limited power. Of course, the common people have almost no power at all. So this is tied to that idea that we talked about last time, the divine right of kings, the idea that the God himself at this point deemed that this individual, this particular king, had the right to rule. Now, one of the things that came with being an absolute monarch, however, was you had to consider the rights of the people, or not the rights necessarily, but the needs of the people. So you did have to consider a little bit about the people when you were making decisions, even though you were supremely powerful. The ultimate of these monarchs was Louis XIV. And essentially what happens is he comes to the throne in 1643 with the help of his assistant, or kind of chief of staff, named Cardinal Richelieu. So they limit the power of the Huguenots and increase the power of the monarchy, and he becomes known as the Sun King. And his power and his ultimate control of what was going on in France really is the primary example of the absolute monarch of this time frame throughout Europe. So what are some examples of the power and Louis XIV? One of the things, if you were an absolute monarch, you wanted to show off a little bit. You wanted to show your amazing amount of power and wealth, and you do that by doing things like building incredible palaces. Now, if any of you have ever been to France, likely right outside of Paris, you've seen the Palace of Versailles. This was what Louis XIV built. It's an incredible, incredible set of buildings, all focused on his power. We want to make sure also that we have the French power is shown both at home and abroad. So we have wars that are waged outside of the French borders to try to consolidate territory in Europe. If you're a powerful monarch, you want to gather as much land as you possibly can. In Germany, or the area we would consider to be Germany at this time, is what's called the Habsburg Empire. And after the 30 Years' War, we saw that the Holy Roman Empire was weakened, but the Habsburg Empire then starts to look to the east. So the West is starting to become its own kind of, Western Europe and Western Germany is doing its own thing. The Habsburg Empire is looking to the east and focusing on areas like Austria and Hungary and the Czech Republic that we think of today. And what happens is the Habsburgs are Catholic, and they give estates to Catholic nobles who are beholden to them. So the Habsburg princes and kings become incredibly powerful, and they create one of the first permanent standing armies. Generally, armies have been only when they're needed. A king would ask people to serve. The Habsburgs actually bring up their own army, and they have their army that's ready to help them at any point. Moving a little further east and looking at the area of Russia, we see also some absolute monarchs that are beginning to form. And the first one of those is really the first absolute czar is Ivan the Terrible. And he ruled from 1533 to 1584. Has one of the great names of all time. And he marries. He was a noble by birth, but he was certainly not destined to be czar. But he marries into it. He marries into the Romanov family, which is the most powerful family in Russia. And he also defeats some of the kings and khans that are threatening his eastern part of his empire and consolidates power. All nobles are required to serve the czar in order to keep their lands. So if you wanted to keep your lands in Russia, you had to, essentially say that you were allegiant to the czar. And he also turns his gaze to the west and wants to try to emulate or copy some of the things that are happening in the Western Europe. After Ivan the Terrible, we have another example in Russia of an absolute monarch, and this is the one who's probably most well known, and that's Peter the Great. He takes power in 1682, and he modernizes the Russian army and really essentially looks to Europe, Western Europe, to copy what they're doing, both politically and in terms of what those absolute monarchs are doing to show their wealth. He creates schools, universities, and training academies to kind of bring Russia up to par with Western Europe. And he really hopes, or brings Western experts in to help modernize Russia. So it's really an opportunity for Russia to take a big step forward under his rule. One of the things we also see that springs up under this time, the absolute time, is the birth of royal cities. Louis XIV did it in Versailles, as we talked about before. Other monarchs in Europe do it with their own royal cities. St. Petersburg in Russia is a good example. These are buildings that exemplify what's called the Baroque style, which is really as much glitter and glamour as you can put on something. That's what they're looking for. Lots of gold, lots of fancy architecture, and it just shows off the wealth. These towns, these royal cities, are essentially divided according to power. So there's an area for the nobility, an area for the bureaucrats, the merchants, and the peasants. And you know exactly what your status is in the nation by knowing where you live in the big city. This is also not only a time of power for the monarch, but it's also a golden age in literature. And underneath within England and France especially, under Elizabeth I and Louis XIV, we see the arts starting to spring up. There's stable rulers, and so arts have an opportunity to flourish. So literature and theater especially do. We see William Shakespeare in England, we see Miguel de Cervantes in Spain, and we see a number of different enlightened writers in France that are all starting to focus on the human condition and really looking at life, a common person's life, and common issues that we all deal with. Love, death, anger, hatred, those type of themes we're seeing within the writing of this time frame. We're also seeing some changes in political thought. And now that we have seen some revolution, we've seen the idea of kind of breaking power down maybe to a little bit more of the nobles and the common people, and then absolutism, which is this ultimate focus of power on kings. People are starting to think about the idea of politics. Where should power be within the whole spectrum? Thomas Hobbes believes that government should control humanity, and they should essentially tell you what you as an individual can do. John Locke, however, believes in something called the natural rights, and that is that every individual should have the right to life, liberty, and property. Now that sounds somewhat familiar because we have that in our Declaration of Independence. We called it life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but the same basic ideas, that everybody should have the ability to obtain these three things, regardless of what station you are in the hierarchy of power. Now we're going to talk about that a lot more as we go, certainly when we see revolutions beginning in America and France and elsewhere in Europe. But for right now, that's enough. Thank you very much, and we'll talk to you in Lesson 4.